The fantasy rugby storylines coming out of round 14's MLR matchups are getting pretty spicy. We break down that and everything else that is on the line heading into our fantasy league's last week of the regular season. The Fantasy Ruckers Show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 18 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thank you so much to our league members. Thank you so much to our community members. And thank you so much to everyone else who's tagging along on this journey of making fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. And like I said at the top of the show, the storylines are getting spicy after round 14's play. And with me to break down round 14 and those exciting storylines, he came out of his self-healing tour. He's not back stateside yet, but he is here on this show. Matthew Yee joining me, Ryan Yee, on the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Dude, how's it going, man? Long time no talk, man. The viewers, the listeners have been waiting for your return.
Long time no talk. I thought, I'd get to see all the boys here. Unfortunately, in this instance, one's going to be traded in for the other, but I decided to take a quick break from my self-healing tour to come talk to the listeners, come talk to the boys. I have stuff to say. I've got stuff to say, and we've got a show today because I've got a lot to get off my chest. It's been 2 weeks.
That's what I'm saying, Matt. You've been away for at least 2 weeks here, and I feel like there's a lot that's been pent up while you've been meditating. I don't know what you've been doing there. It seems to have been working because the past 2 weeks for you have been absolutely stellar. We're gonna break down how you did in round 14 because, man, it was pretty impressive. Was it enough for you to get the win? You're going to have to stay tuned to find out. But yeah, unfortunately, we are out with our third musketeer. We thought we'd all be back together this show, but unfortunately, Vandy has suffered an accident at work that has put him out of commission. He is okay and everything is fine, but he does have to take a little bit of break here. So our best wishes from the Fantasy Ruckers, I'm sure the league members as well, Vandy, that you make a quick and speedy recovery here and that you're back on this show talking all that smack to Matt and learning this fantasy rugby game as you go on here. We're itching to have you back on this show.
Yeah, we love you, Vandy.
There we go. Yeah, we absolutely love that guy, and we hope that he does
well. I thought it would be too soon for anything too toxic. So I thought I'd just leave it at that.
Well, Matt, we'll leave it at that at the top, and now I think we've laid it all out, and now we can say whatever we want about Vandy. We've gotten that out of the way, and now we can lean in on him. And I'm sure there's a lot that you'll be wanting to lean on Vandy, especially after the past 2 weeks, and especially how that interesting bet between you and him has gone, and we'll be looking heading into this final week. But we're gonna break that all down this episode. We're gonna break down those storylines. We're gonna break down the fantasy performances in round 14, and like we said, there's a lot on the line heading into this final week. And as commissioner of the inaugural MLR Fantasy League, I must say I really could not ask for a better turnout heading into round 15. I don't know how it worked out. I don't know how it all situated itself, but man, it's going to be an exciting round 15 with a lot of fantasy matchups that are going to have huge implications to how the fantasy playoffs look and some other side bets that we have on the way too. So we're going to break that all down and give everyone a preview of this final matchup. But before we do that, just get some housekeeping out of the way. Make sure you're following, liking, and subscribing to us at the Fantasy Ruckers everywhere on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, on YouTube as well. You can watch the video portion of this podcast on YouTube. You can give us a subscribe there. Goes a long way for us in seeing that support. And hey, join in on the conversation too. Drop a comment. Let us know what you think of the show. Let us know what you think of fantasy rugby. We always like to hear that. So we always look forward to what your thoughts and opinions are on our fantasy rugby league. So with that being said, Matt, we have a lot of catching up to do, you and I, and let's start that off by catching up with some news and notes that you may have missed over the past week or so. I feel like you need to get a little bit caught up here after being in the boonies without any connection. I think I didn't tell the viewers this or the listeners this, but you were mailing by bottle message in a bottle your fantasy lineup each week. You know,
this is what I wanted to tell the people first. I messaged these lineups 5 weeks ago in a bottle from the Pacific Ocean. It went to the Atlantic, and it somehow went through the river system and ended up at Ryan's doorstep.
Yeah, and apparently whatever lineup was in that bottle must have been magic or something, because something seems to be working for you. But like I said, we will break that down. But yeah, let's talk about these news and notes. The biggest one, and it literally just came down within hours of recording this podcast. Nehe Milner-Skudder, all New Zealand All Black. He won 13 caps for them. He's making the move stateside, and he is going to Rugby New York, joining his, I believe, his former teammate Waisake Nahalo over there on Rugby New York. I really think there's really not much explaining that needs to be done with this move. Matt, I'll just let you take it away with this.
Well, I'm just going to say that they're one back away from completing the Rugby World Cup New Zealand back three. Right?
What do we have? So we have Andy Ellis.
So, I mean, Andy Ellis was like another time with them.
Okay.
But we've gotten a hollow Milner-Skudder, and I think all that's missing is Ben Smith. I'm pretty sure that's all that's missing. Too bad Ben Smith, his head is, donezo. But the other thing that I think about this one is I think Rugby New York has no idea how many back three they're allowed to have at once. I mean, what is going on here? You got Sam Windsor at 15, or you got Milner-Skudder at 15. They're putting endless pictures of Nahalo at training, so clearly he's on his way.
Right.
But then Fido comes out with the last game looking like a beast. And then you got Ko there, who's still, even though he's, coming off injury, like, he still has had an unreal season. What are you going to do? How many back three are you going to put in there? What are you going to do? What does one do when they're scratched or on the bench?
Right. Well, I mean, I guess it goes, there's something to be said about collecting talent, them creating, I guess, like a stateside version of a older All Blacks team might be their way of doing it. But it'll be interesting. I think, at least to bring this back fantasy perspective wise, I think it is going to be interesting to see how our fantasy managers in our league approach this whole situation, because we had the whole hype of Waisake Nahalo, right? Yeah. And we remember Malcolm, our league manager who owns Victoria's Secret, he locked up a playoff spot in this past week. He's looking pretty. So if Waisake Nahalo is able to enter the lineup going forward, that might be a big acquisition for him going into playoffs. But that being said, he hasn't yet to make an appearance. And I believe he made this roster move, what, Matt, 3 weeks ago? I think he dropped the historical like $32 fab dollars on Waisake Nahalo, and he has yet to see any of that pay off, any of that $32 pay off yet. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not that deters people from maybe dropping a lot of fab bucks on Nehe Milner-Skudder. That being said, I mean, it's another All Black coming to the MLR who is going to make an impact if he breaks the lineup. What's going to happen? Yeah,
but you got to think about it the other way. Is that Fido, Nahalo, Milner-Skudder now are supposed to be, you spend 32 or whatever fab on Nahalo, expecting him to score a lot. What are you going to drop another 32 expecting Milner-Skudder to score a lot? Probably not, but that's why you would pick him up or drop fab on him. Only one, unless they're putting up 30, 40 points a game, how many tries is each back three going to get, right?
Right,
so it's
right.
And somebody's got to sit. They can't all play 80 minutes. They're going to want to get other people in too. So I don't know. I personally are not even going to make a claim. One, because, hey, I clinched playoff non-contention. So that's my life.
Hey, you still have something on the line, which we will talk about.
Line, which we'll get to. But even if I'm going in playoffs, you have to win semis, I would presume, before you can actually maybe play them by the finals. So,
yeah, I
would
don't
you even
know.
Play him by the finals in his first match in?
That's what I'm saying, right? Like you don't even have the luxury now that as we approach fantasy playoffs of maybe seeing a week or two. If he gets in the lineup this week, then you're golden, right? Because then you have a little bit more confidence. But if the first time he breaks a lineup is in week 17 in your final championship week,
Yeah.
What are the chances that he only plays, 40 minutes? You know what I mean?
Or
What if
you
he,
even trust him enough to start him because you've had guys who've produced for you already.
Right. Because that's a great point, Matt, because I'm assuming the two teams that do make our fantasy championship playoffs are going to have competitive guys on their roster, right? And I don't know, maybe putting in Nehe Milner-Skudder or maybe putting in Wysocki Naholo, if they do break the lineup come playoff time, maybe that's the championship winning move that's going to win one of our league managers the inaugural fantasy playoff. But I don't know. That's going to be an interesting decision whether or not come playoff time and whether or not they finally do break the lineup here, because we have yet to see, like we said, Wysocki Naholo enter the Rugby New York lineup. If you had to put your money on it, Matt, before I move on here to some final news here, if you had to put your money on it, what does that back line look like? So it seems like they've gone more with Andy Ellis. I can't imagine that they're changing their centers between Emery and Fuatai, because they've been a lock at those spots all season long. You're really playing with those back threes. So now you're playing with what are the options there? You see Wysocki Naholo, Nehe Milner-Skudder. Troy Lockyer's injured, so you're maybe thinking that Milner-Skudder's replacing him at the fullback position, but you still have Sam Windsor, you have Hyden, you have you have Ed Fido. What's your money on those back three players?
I mean, I'm going to go Hyden. Well, I'll start with Ellis and then Hyden, Emery, Fuatai, and then I'm going to say Fido on the blind side or at 11, and then Naholo at 14. And then I'm going to say once Milner-Skudder's eligible, I think he goes in at 15. Just because agree. I mean,
Troy Lockyer is battling injury, so there is that kind of assistance.
As good as Sam Windsor is, it's tough. You go Sam Windsor or Nehe Milner-Skudder. I mean, it's tough go.
And it's hard to pull Hyden out of the lineup too, because he's looked pretty stellar, at the fly half position.
But
I mean, Sam Windsor
and Co coming off the bench. I mean, that's 22 and 23.
That is true. And I mean, I guess that adds to the final point here, is that it would be one thing if these players were going to a team that was back needy, but we're talking about, and I've mentioned on these previous shows, Matt, that I think, in my opinion, that Rugby New York has, if not the best, one of the best backlines in the entire MLR, and that is before Wysocki Naholo, and that is before Nehe Milner-Skudder, and now those two guys are just being added to that. It's just absolutely crazy. It does cause headaches in the fantasy world, but that being said, I think from an MLR perspective, fans and Rugby New York fans especially are going to be pretty excited to see those former All Blacks taking the field once they finally do. So massive signing for Rugby New York, who continues to add to that back line. Moving on to some other kind of bigger news here. Not so much roster move related, but this is some big developments in terms of growth of the game. And we mentioned a couple weeks back about the announcement of the Collegiate Rugby Shield being broadcasted on Fox Sports 2, and that is the collection of the best collegiate players across the United States coming together to play in one match that will be televised both on Fox Sports and on the Rugby Network. And the reason why I say Fox Sports now is because now it is officially announced that it is now no longer on Fox Sports 2, which the MLR has notably been on. It is now on Fox Sports 1, Matt. We're moving up to the number one digit here. Isn't that's a big one?
Dude, that's fantastic to hear. I guess, America loves watching college sports.
I guess so. But hey, on a positive note, I mean, it can only help grow the game to, get some eyes on these young up-and-coming talent, homegrown talent from the USA, and showcase that and see if that maybe draws any attention. Because maybe you're not a rugby fan, but hey, maybe one of the guys that's playing because he goes to your school or he played at your club. Maybe that gets into the MLR.
Yeah, but what are we doing playing them on Fox Sports 1 when we can be playing the MLR on Fox Sports 1?
Well, that costs money, Matthew. They don't.
The best that we got. Are we showing them
I mean, I feel like there's some other stuff on Fox Sports 1 on Sundays. I can't necessarily put my finger on it, but there are some big things. But hey, one day maybe. One day we'll see. And just to add to that, they did announce also the coaches for the Collegiate Rugby Shield, and that's going to be Harvard's Mel Denham and St. Bonaventure's Tui Osborne. So those two will be coaching the two sides in that Collegiate Rugby Shield game, and that game airs on Fox Sports 1 once again on July 2nd at 7 p.m. So that's going to be exciting to watch to see the new up-and-coming American talent, the best of the best, playing in an exciting matchup that will be nationally televised. And then moving on last here, or a couple things here, a couple roster or trade moves that we kind of miss, and this happened, I would say, within the last week, so a little bit late on it here. And the reason why I want to touch on it, a flurry of Dallas Jackals moves, not going to get into that. Looks like they're kind of shifting some stuff around. But the big one that I want to touch on, and it seems like, and we had a conversation, Matt, like about this earlier in the season, about the idea of salary cap considerations and how this seems to be the word that we're seeing a lot of in these trades. And it seems like it is important enough where the Giltinis and the Nola Gold have come together to make a trade, and that occurred back on May 5th of 2022. I guess they're getting ready for a playoff push here, Matt, because to alleviate some cap space here for the Giltinis, they gave up a first-round pick and a third-round pick. In addition, there are the rights to Sam Klinkowski, who is a player that the Giltinis drafted. However, that's a lot to give up for salary cap considerations.
Yeah, but I'm starting to think you really don't need draft picks when you can just buy these guys coming off out of nowhere. Decide that you're going to get the entire back line for the Rugby World Cup win, using the All Blacks. Yeah, I mean, I would rather have salary cap considerations than drafting these collegiate guys. No offense to the guys from Life University, but hey,
Fair enough. That is true. I mean, there are some notable players. I mean, a guy like Connor Mooneyham was a first round draft pick. He's been making an impact on the Gilgronis, players like that. But you're right. When guys are signing big name, you're not getting anyone like Nehe Milner-Scudder or Waisaku Naholo in this collegiate draft. So completely get that. But it was just interesting that the Giltinis receiving or the NOLA receiving the first round pick, the third round pick, and playing service rights to Sam Klinkowski, front row player, in return for salary cap considerations. So those salary cap considerations are obviously very, very valuable. And then lastly, just moving on here, a big suspension. It was mentioned closer to last week's show, but it's having rippling effects for our fantasy playoffs. And that is Jameson Fanana Schultz. He has been suspended 10 weeks for an egregious play, and you can listen to it last show where we broke it down. Just not what we need in rugby right now. So completely understand the suspension there, and he does have a history. Man. Yeah, he does have a history of getting aggressive and tiptoeing that line in the past. So if you do have him on the fantasy roster, I believe Rugby Morning has him on his fantasy roster. He'll be looking for a replacement because he won't be back anytime soon. So that will do it for the news and notes here. The last thing I think as we move on, and it's not really news and notes, Matt, you kind of mentioned it quickly before the show. And it's, I feel like we've seen a flurry of it since you've been gone. And that is these wave of city uniforms. Quick opinion on these city uniforms. They just released Houston's one that kind of has a space theme in homage to NASA, and we got a problem, Houston. Thoughts on these city jerseys? San Diego released one. Pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if I want to keep Team City skyline, just, play the game.
It does seem like that is the growing theme. Is let's just
it's
slap
like they
on
took city a bit too literal over
there. No kidding, right? Hey, city jersey. Oh crap. Okay, that literally put the city on the jersey. Okay, we're good. We got it covered.
It's like the fade out color, the fade color jerseys. That was just the first template that they saw, so they just kept picking that one, and then this is the city
now,
one. I heard city, and they just were like, oh.
I will say one of the trends that I did notice that did make a slight comeback this past week. I don't know if it was Seattle's city jerseys, but the jerseys, the black ones that they wore this past weekend, they were very nice. But it was that stupid color on color number scheme. So from my perspective, no, we do not like that. From my perspective, statting things out, we don't like that. The Gilgronis had that last year. Seattle, please don't wear those jerseys again. So there was that. But all right, lots of literal city skylines on these city jerseys, which are pretty funny.
Yeah. The only last thing I'll say is Fa'anana, you are a Ba'anana. That's all I can say. You stink. Let's move
And
on.
that's what we missed from you, Matt. We missed the unreal nicknames that you were able to think on the fly. Ba'anana Schultz. Yeah, he surely was a Ba'anana decision to drop that knee when he did that in
Dropping fists, dropping knees. Let's
round
move
13.
on. See you later.
Yeah. No, it doesn't need any more time on this show, that's for sure. So yeah, let's move on to round 13's matches and go over some of the fantasy performance that we saw in this past weekend. It was a week, Matt, of highs and lows, and you'll understand why as we break it down. Had some pretty tight matchups, and then we had matchups that were low scoring, and then we had a historically high matchup, and one that we probably expected was going to be a historically high matchup. But yeah, let's get into it. Let's break it all down. It was the NOLA Gold that was on bye this week, so they didn't have any fantasy performers in this one. But let's hop right into that first matchup of the week that happened on Saturday. New England Free Jacks taking on Old Glory DC. New England Free Jacks edges out DC 26-20. But DC making it pretty interesting for a decent amount of time there. But we did see that the Free Jacks' ability to kind of, have these explosive plays did kind of peek through there by the end of the match, which ultimately won them the game.
Yeah, they look good. But I mean, my one takeaway from this was if the season started, 3 weeks ago, and we had this level Old Glory DC, we have a completely different outcome of the season, I think, for them, because they found a form and they look good. And when you put it up against the Free Jacks like that, as a team that's basically in last place, you're doing pretty well.
Yeah, no, I mean, top fantasy performers, 3 top fantasy performers in this match, all Old Glory DC players. You're talking about Doug Fraser with 12.8 fantasy points. You're talking about Robbie Ormescu, who also, who I believe got 12.8 fantasy points, and then Junior Sau, 8.1 fantasy points. So both DC players there, scoring big for their respective teams. So yeah, I mean, and that's with that. Remember when you were saying earlier in the season, Matt, about how the loss of Mike Dubalis or the insert of him would be kind of the turning point for this DC team. They're doing it without him because he's out for the season. Yep. So it is interesting to see how he has, I guess his loss has kind of inversely helped this DC team kind of look better, and not that his absence has made it look better, but it's funny how they are picking things up in spite of losing him. This
is true, but I think they kind of hit one of those, like, they just got in a roll and suddenly they're not, having a knock on every other pass, and they're having some continuation in their passenger play. So it was about time. I think they were just looking for it, and it's just about time.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And apologies, a little bit of a correction here. Robbie Ormescu did not. I saw that number on there. It wasn't him who got 12.8 fantasy points. It was just Doug Fraser in that match. But still, the top two fantasy performers part of that back line in DC, Doug Fraser and Junior Sau. Junior Sau getting 8.1 fantasy points. And then on the New England Free Jack side, 7.4 fantasy points, 6.4 fantasy points for Slade McDowell and Mills Sanarivi, respectively. And then, hey, Jesse Parati, he's also coming through with 4 fantasy points there. And then Bodine Waka also 4 fantasy points. So we always see his name on the score sheet. For me, my final takeaway, Matt, from this match, when New England has that ability to score first, which they did once again, and they have this ability for teams to play on the back foot, it makes it that much harder to beat this Free Jacks team. But I do think that the DC team did have a really good job this past week of limiting those explosive plays that we were able to see from New England Free Jacks, usually on a week in and week out basis. I don't think they had any try that exceeded, I want to say, like 15 to 20 meters, which is not usually something seen. Usually on the New England Free Jacks score sheet, we're seeing a try of at least 30 to 40 meters you would expect from some of those guys. So I think the recipe for success when it comes to playing this Free Jacks team moving forward, especially into playoff time, is going to be to limit those big plays. But you saw it. They still were able to squeak in these 15-meter tries that at the end got them the edge over Old Glory DC, the 26-20 win. But to your point, Matt, if we had seen this DC team a little bit earlier in the season, who knows what this Old Glory team could be doing at this point, right, if it was like that. So interesting to say there. Let's move on here. Man, I wanted Vandy to be on this show for this matchup. I mean, talk about probably Utah's biggest win of the year. I'm just gonna say. I mean, they're out of the playoffs. They're going up against a Rugby Atlanta team that everyone is really, really high on. Everyone expected. I mean, we had our new pick segment last show where all three of us picked Rugby Atlanta. Utah coming through here, man. 44-26 victory, and outside of it being kind of close, I would say towards the half, Utah really pulled away through it after, I believe, that 45th minute try by Tien Erasmus. It really was no looking back for this Warrior squad. Yeah,
I mean, first of all, Lance Williams is a beast.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, linebacker out of Hawaii, apparently.
Yep.
So that guy,
what a try,
fitting in just fine.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, no, Utah. I mean, they look good. Their backline looked good. I mean, John must have hated the fact that Mikey Teo just passed up that last try. That would have been a big one. But I don't know. I don't know if it really mattered to him. But no, I mean, it's nice to see Utah win. I was gonna be cheering for Vandy and genuinely be happy for Vandy, but I'm just happy the Rugby Atlanta boys still got points for me. I don't even care how they do. But they look a little shaken, it seems like.
Yeah, well, hey, that's just fantasy for you. It doesn't matter who's actually winning these matchups. It doesn't matter if you're already a fan of these teams. When you're playing fantasy rugby, you have a little bit more skin in the game, so you're looking out for some other performances. But yeah, it was a huge performance by Lance Williams. He led the match with the most fantasy points, 15.9 fantasy points, and I believe it was in this match that maul that they were doing from the 22-meter line, where they just drove all the way down. You love to see that. It's pretty funny. And then I will say too, I believe it was the Utah Warriors match. I want to say it was the Utah Warriors match. It was I believe it was Lance Williams' first try, I want to say, and they had the maul or the line out on the 6-meter line, and you can see all of the guys, the bench players for Utah start to get ready to warm up. And I'm thinking in my head, I'm like, they ain't coming down to get a quick warm up in. They're coming down because they want to be part of this celebration. Yeah. So then, lo and behold, Lance Williams takes it in for the 6-meter maul try, and all the bench players wearing their pennies are right there, and they come in, and all of them like, you guys are getting a quick warm up. That's
no surprise there, that's for sure. But
so fantasy performers, top 2, Lance Williams, and a new face that we haven't seen before, Joe Mano with 15.5 fantasy points. He was the benefactor of that Mike Teo handoff that you said, and those are going to be the things, man, and we know it firsthand from fantasy football about garbage time, about just these random plays that are going to have no impact on the actual rugby game itself. But when it comes to fantasy, it has miles and miles of impacts. And just imagine if you have Joe Mano and you're in a tight matchup and you see Mike Teo handed off from the 30-meter line for no apparent reason. Mike Teo had the try, but he's just like, hey, Joe Mano, you got one? Let's give you another in your first showing with the Utah Warriors. Why not, right? But man, if luckily John didn't play Mike Teo this week because he saw that he wasn't starting, so he didn't have the whole oh my gosh, why'd you offload it deal. But if he did have him in the lineup, or if he did score that try and he was on the lineup, it would just been whole sorts of emotions. Yeah. But yeah, it was funny to see. I will say on the Rugby Atlanta side, the set piece looking pretty solid, Matt. They were a big benefactor for you when it comes to you having their set piece, them scoring 5 fantasy points for you, 2 big set piece tries. Connor Cook being the big benefactor from that. He racked up 13 fantasy points. And then going down the list, 7.5 fantasy points for Calvin Whiting, a lot of that coming off the boot. And then you got 7 fantasy points for Caleb McEnany, Caleb McEnany getting 6.8 fantasy points, and then Tiana Rasmuth with that try, 5.6 fantasy points, and then big pickup by you, Matt. You couldn't get Tiana Rasmuth, but you still got Alex Mons. So you got the second best who also scored a try. So I guess that message in a bottle was able to look into the future a little bit and get the second best score try. Let's move on to the next matchup here. Toronto Arrows, Rugby New York. And I want to start this off by saying it was great to see Andrew Coe back in the starting lineup this week.
Yeah.
He obviously back home, right? So that's what I was just going to say, was that obviously he faced that injury about, I want to say, a month or so ago, has been trying to work his way back in the lineup. And I can only imagine, obviously we haven't talked to him since he's had that injury, but I could only imagine how hard and doing everything in his power to make the lineup for this match. Obviously, for you guys who don't know, Andrew Coe is a Canadian international, was part of the Canadian Rugby Sevens team for a while there, went to the Olympics. He's grew up in the greater Toronto area. So I can only imagine going back to York University in Toronto, get all his friends and family out for him to be in that lineup. He was making sure that he was getting into that starting lineup for that match. I'm sure he had that May date circled in his calendar. So it was great to see him back in that starting lineup. So great to see him out there. But yeah, let's break it down. I don't know if there's much to break down here, Matt, but Rugby New York just looked dominant from start to finish. 41-17 for Rugby New York. I will continue to say this. They look like the best backline in the entire MLR, and you add that on top of the athletic forwards they have, the ability for especially a guy like Cara Pryor to move around the pitch the way that I saw him move around the pitch, being a key cog in some of those big tries in this past weekend, to see him moving around the pitch the way he was, man. If Rugby New York can piece all of that together the way they did against the Toronto Arrows, this is going to be a very dangerous team heading into the MLR playoffs in a few weeks' time.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised. First of all, I thought that the Arrows were going to at least have this pretty close. They're at home. They are gunning for a win at home, especially against Rugby New York. But I guess Andrew Cole and the rest of the Rugby New York lads didn't make it too easy for them. And it was really off the back of the guy that you said, Cara Pryor. I mean, he's just doing what he did in New Zealand, just in the MLR. And then Fido as well. I mean, Fido was an absolute beast. And then we've already touched on them, but that center combo is just – it's tough to beat when they got both the hands and the line break ability with both of them. So Rugby New York definitely looks good.
And you mentioned Ed Fido. He's starting to make himself a name in the world of fantasy rugby, because he's now looking, after having a stretch of quiet weeks there, he's now sitting second spot in our overall fantasy rankings on the year. Not too far behind, about, I want to say, 20 to 30 points behind Bodine Walker, which is incredible to see.
Yeah, doesn't kick. And I feel like he's just gotten all these points from these like massive bursts of games.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you mentioned week 2, 22.5. Week 3, 12.9, week 8, 7.3, and then week 12, 17.1, week 13, 9.3. Yeah, these past 3 weeks have been incredible for Fido, and then 17.3 in week 14. So, this is just the perfect time that Ed Fido is getting hot for John heading into playoffs, who he has also locked in a spot as well. So, yeah, Fido, 17.3 fantasy points. Hey, your boy Jack Hyden looking pretty good off the boot. Yep. He racked up 11.9 fantasy points.
Hey, hold on. What's up with this? I noticed Jack Hyden started the game kicking. Sam Windsor hit the conversion for the last try of the game. Mm-hmm. But I'm pretty sure Jack Hyden was still on. What's going on here? What am I supposed to do? I'm going to keep both of them. What do I do? What do I do?
You got to keep Sam Windsor loose, man. I don't know. Maybe it's not enough for a back flex spot.
I think I gotta make a deal with the commissioner to let me change between Windsor or Hyden, depending on who takes
Sam Hyden or Jack Sam Windsor.
Yes.
There we go. Yeah, well, we'll see whether or not we can create a Frankenstein. Jack Hyden's fly half playing ability, and then Sam Windsor's boot. We'll do some talking. Now that you're in last place, I feel, or now that you're out of the playoffs, I feel like we can have a little fun with these things. So maybe.
Here we
Hey,
go.
maybe you'll make that bet.
Influence some bets. Who knows?
Maybe make your bet a whole lot more interesting. Just to talk about another performances, Fuaasu Fuatai. Fa'asu Fuatai on Rugby New York, the center there. We mentioned him being part of that good center line, 10.3 fantasy points for him. And then Cole Brown making his MLR debut for the Toronto Arrows, 7.1 fantasy points, scoring a try in his first appearance. Pretty crazy stuff there. So, lots of points on the Rugby New York side, not so much on the Toronto Arrows side. Now moving on quickly here to the LA Giltinis Austin Gilgronis match, man. And I feel like this is a matchup that a lot of people predicted was going to be a high scoring occasion. But hey, I guess in hindsight, it is 2020. These are two very good defensive sides. We've seen them play like that before. We've seen them hold teams to low scores before. And they showcased that in this matchup, really forcing errors on opposing sides. It was a physical and gritty matchup between this low scoring affair between the Gilgronis and the Giltinis.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking every other game was high scoring and had lots of fantasy points in it. And then the top two teams decide to go against each other. One of the top two teams decide to go against each other and put up absolute goose eggs in the fantasy world in terms of points. Just crazy how it works like that. But yeah, interesting to see Giltinis come out ahead on top. Yeah, I mean, it's a tight one. The good teams will win those ones, and Giltini seem like you said, they're making a big push.
And I will say, Will McGee, flying out for the Gilgronis, he's probably shaking his head. Not only did he miss the game-tying conversion in overtime, essentially, in extra over the 80th minute, which I feel was a pretty makeable kick that he could. And then also, I mean, earlier in the match too, he missed some key penalties as well that would have kind of gave them some point advantages heading into that later port.
He missed one about 15 meters to the right of the post.
Yeah.
So honestly,
I mean,
before
now
I
mind
saw
you,
the last kick, I thought,
game over. This is done.
But yeah, no, I mean, mind you, Harrison Goddard did miss a kick that was pretty easy on his own as well. But still, not exactly what you want to see from the Gilgroni side. Yeah, it was a tight man, and I will also add that the final like 3-4 minute series there for when the Gilgronis really put down their head and was really desperate to score that try, and they ultimately ended up doing that. Man, that was a fun series to watch. I mean, they really pounded and worked the Giltinis on that line there. Yeah. Now, give credit to the Giltinis for showing that good defensive effort on the end. They did have some disciplinary issues that I think it was inevitable that they were going to score that try, but still, it was a lot of fun to watch. And you could tell that these are two teams that understood that there was a lot on the line, and they were kind of, playing to the occasion. And I'm sure the match that we're going to see, if these two teams do meet in the MLR playoffs, is going to be just as gritty. But maybe they take a few more chances here and there, and maybe we see a little bit higher scoring affair, which will translate to fantasy. But yeah, guys that made a performance for fantasy in this one: Ben Lesage, try score, 6.7 fantasy points, and then Chris Mattina, 5.6 fantasy points for him because he scored the try on the Gilgroni side. And then add the two kickers, Goddard and McGee, 5.5, 4.5 respectively. That was really all that was relatable from a fantasy perspective here. A lot more of an enjoyable game to watch rather than from a fantasy perspective. Moving on to our last two matches of the week here: San Diego Legion taking on the Houston SaberCats. And Matt, I was glad that we could bring you back on the show for this one, because since you took your little hiatus, I felt we left on a note where I was saying that this Houston SaberCats team may be making a late push here. And man, after looking pretty good after the past few weeks and now beating the San Diego Legion team that we thought was pretty competitive here, 34-24. I don't know, man. The SaberCats look like they're going to make a push for the playoffs here, at least in these final few weeks.
Yeah, you want to hear something crazy? I think it's not what I said. I think it's actually that the Houston SaberCats and the Rock and Roll Fantasy Rugby team are now one team. They beat the Giltinis first week, right?
Yeah.
I got a win first week.
Yeah.
Right? I beat Vandy first week, I think.
Okay.
I lost for a long time.
Houston lost for a long time.
Right? Well, actually, Houston goes 3-0, but well, that's neither here nor there. Anyways, I start getting good, right? I go on this hiatus. I start getting good. Who else starts getting good? the Houston Space Cats.
The Houston Space Force.
The Space Force. They start getting good. So
Yeah.
my conclusion, we are now one.
you and Houston are one team. Okay, well, hope we'll see whether or not that keeps on going. But yeah, big performers in this one. I mean, it was a pretty back and forth affair. Houston, I don't know what it is, man, but they're looking pretty solid. I mean, some fantasy performance from their end, 6.5 for Dean Muir. That set piece is looking pretty okay for the SaberCats. Marcel Muller is a new name that we're seeing, 6.4 fantasy points. Juan Pablo Zeiss getting in there too, 6.3. And then Gideon Van Wyck as well, 5.8 fantasy points too. And then the next guy is Peter Malcolm for San Diego Legion, 5.6. And the only others for San Diego, Ryan Mathias, who scored a try, 7.1. And then Will Hooley with the boot, having a huge kicking performance, 8 points. Really was the only thing that kept them in the match. But yeah, it wasn't a result that I thought we were going to get. But man, Houston definitely making it look interesting heading into the final saga of the 2022 MLR campaign. That's for sure. Okay, and then last one. I mean, can we say that we saved the best for last? I don't know, but
what did we learn from this? What did we learn from this game other than Riker Hyden?
Well, it's not, Matt. It's not what we learned from this game, right? I feel like this whole fantasy season, right, has been a whole lot of hectic, right? It's been a whole lot of I don't know what the heck is going on, a whole lot of learning on the fly. But the one thing that has been consistent, at least from week one, it seems like, is the notion that if you are a league manager in fantasy rugby within the MLR, you do everything in your power to start any player against the Dallas Jackals, because man, a 74-7 performance by the Seattle Seawolves beating the Dallas Jackals, that's just a whole nother cherry on top. An absolute historical performance by the Seattle Seawolves. They were not taking their foot off the gas pedal, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, Ross Neal was pretty gutsy to come off and pull off call the ball while this guy's on a break. They're up by what? 65 to 7.
Yeah.
And he decides he's going to kill this guy's entire career by calling the ball while he's on a break, gets the ball back, chips and chases, and ends up with it back in his hands for a try.
Right.
I mean, great for my fantasy team, but dang, Ross Neal, like, chill out a little bit.
No chill on that too. And I believe, I want to say on... No, it wasn't that match, but yeah, they definitely didn't let up. They were going in on that, and they were having a lot of fun with that. I'm trying to find the stat here.
Dallas Jackals, holy, do they stink?
Yeah, I mean, it is the most ever tries scored by a single team, 11 total tries in a single match. It's the most points ever scored by a single team, obviously with the 74 points. And it's also the largest margin of victory with 67 points. So yeah, they're checking off all the historical boxes there. We could have seen this come in, not that we were going to predict a 67-point margin, but we knew that there was going to be a lot of fantasy points to be had. So if we did not make it clear, up to this point, Matt, would you like to make it clear for the people what you do with your players against Dallas Jackals?
Yeah, you pick them up and you start them. All of them. Even the guys on the bench. Ross Neal was on the bench and came on for, I think, 30 minutes. And he scored a 40-meter try. You start them all. Even number 24, maybe you start.
Yeah, you really just pick at all of them. It is funny, Matt, when you told me that about you didn't even care that Ross Neal was coming off the bench, because usually what has been the trend for fantasy managers for a majority of the season has been if the player, unless they're desperate, if the player is on the bench, chances are you're not starting that player. But yeah, you came up to me and you're like, dude, it doesn't even matter. Ross Neal's on the bench. I'm starting this guy anyways. And hey, it paid off too, because he still ended up getting 12.8 fantasy points. And I think that was within a span of like something like 30 minutes. So yeah, you're right.
But I remember pondering getting Futi, and Futi scored 2 Futis. So that would have been a good one too.
That would have been a good one, yeah. Liana Futi, I hope I'm saying that name right. 15.5 fantasy points. He also had 2 tries, and then the big fantasy performer in there. So it was Futi second in this game, Neal third in this game, but first on the Seattle Seawolves. Man, AJ Alatimu, he's also even coming off of that 1 week of injury. He's been a fantasy gem this season.
Alatimu got first?
Who? Yeah, Alatimu got first.
I thought you were going to say Riker, the beast
No.
addict.
Well, he was going to get first, and let me get into why he didn't get first. But Alatimu got first. Obviously, a lot of that had to do with the kicking ability. 6.5 fantasy points on the week. He now sits third total overall on the season so far. He looks to be a gem that was picked up by Dankus Anchors Hokie in our first fantasy MLR draft there. But yeah, Alatimu looks really good. But let me talk about Rickard Hadding, because on top of the consistent idea of playing your players against the Dallas Jackals, something else that seems to be consistent too, on a week in and week out basis, or at least on weeks that Rickard Hadding scores 2 tries, is he always pairs those 2 tries up with the yellow card. So even in the match against the Dallas Jackals, he pairs that up with a yellow card. So he would have had a big performance. He still racked up 12.2 fantasy points, but that was -4 off of the yellow card. So that buffered it a little bit there for him. The only fantasy performer for the Dallas Jackals was Carlo Denician. He scored 6.1 fantasy points, scoring the lone try for the Dallas Jackals.
We can just start adding a template for when the Dallas Jackals play. The only Dallas point scorer was the one person that scored the 5-meter try.
Right. Or some random. Yeah, there's one person going to score on the Dallas Jackals, and it's just banking your money on who that person is going to be. Now, I will say, before we move on here to a big Commissioner League update, probably the biggest of the season so far, I will say, Matt, that you can pick up all the players that are going to play against the Dallas Jackals. That is not guaranteeing that they are going to all perform against the Dallas Jackals, because even with a 74 point performance, you might have felt nice about it, but Vandy had some Seattle players that were on his team that didn't really perform, that didn't. So you're taking a bet, but you're hedging your bet. Chances are you're going to get you guys.
Everybody except Vandy, pick up your guys that are playing the Dallas Jackals, because they'll go off for you as long as they're not on Vandy's team.
Yeah, you're lucky that he is in here to say something different about that, because I'm sure those pickups are the guys that are playing the Dallas Jackals next week. Yeah, I think you and Vandy are going to be fighting over some of those guys with how much is on the line for your fantasy matchup. But with that being said, let's break down on what is on the line for some of these fantasy matchups after the results that were in round 14.
Oh no, it's back.
You're right, Matt. The town crier is back. That's right. Hear ye. The Commissioner Ye is back with your weekly league update. Didn't you miss it, Matt? You missed it, didn't you? You missed this weekly update. The 2 minutes that really was the highlight of your week, right?
Yes, it was everything I was missing in my Tuesdays. This is exactly what I've been waiting for.
There we go. Well, let's hop right into it. And what's better than bringing you back from your self-healing tour after racking up some pretty crazy fantasy performances? What's better to welcome you back? At least Hokie gave you a big welcome back with a 1.7 margin, or excuse me, a 2.2 margin loss against Hokie when you put up your biggest point performance of the year. Just kind of goes to show you how your fantasy season has been going all year long so far. Dankus Anchors, 50.5 fantasy points on the week. An absolute massive performance for Dankus Anchors in what was a huge week for the guy that sits atop of our rankings against you, Matt. Ruck and roll, 48.3 point performance. I mean, you had the boys, Jack Hyden, Fuatai, Ross Neal, all coming through for you. It was just that big AJ Alatimu performance that really hurt you. And I will say, maybe playing Christian Dyer would have helped, but I will say Ben Lesage and Dylan Smith were both on the bench for the Dankus Anchors. That would have made it an even more historical performance for the number 1 team in our league. Before I move on to matchup number 2, Matt, do you have any words to say on this matchup?
You know what? I, at this point, am just happy I'm peaking at the wrong time. It is just awesome.
I mean, we keep on teasing it about your bet. You could argue that you're peaking at the right time.
This is true.
Aside from the fantasy performance.
And I'm racking up points for for the end of the season.
Well, when I go through this when I go through these standings right here, man, this 48.3 performance did not go without a waste, Matt. So we'll say why.
Don't worry, Hokie, we're cool for now.
There we go. Moving on to matchup number 2. And man, we got to talk about this team, dude. Farrell Hippie, Stephen Lowen, he has turned this team around since he has taken over. Now, I don't have the record of what he has since he has taken over, but it has been good enough to bring his team up back to 500, and he finds himself sitting right in the heat of a playoff hunt, which we did not think was going to be possible when he first took over this team. He beats Rugby Morning 27.6 to 12.6, and it really couldn't have been a bigger matchup. That was off of the back of Junior Sau's 8.1 fantasy performance and Dean Muir's 6.5. I mean, Steven was probably sweating when he saw Kian Meaden's and Peter Malcolm's 9.6 and 5.6 fantasy performance sitting there on his bench. But lo and behold, it didn't matter. He still was able to come away with the big 15-point win over Rugby Morning. Dylan Fawcett's 5.6 try wasn't enough. And then Rugby Morning, although it wouldn't have made a difference, is probably kicking himself that he didn't have Caleb McEnany on the field in his fantasy matchup over Joaquin de la Vega Mendia, who was the kicker for him, who was not kicking for Rugby Atlanta. I know, and it's tough for that match because Joaquin de la Vega Mendia has been out, but then he's had these these spurts of really good performance, so it's hard to bench the guy. So I kind of feel the love-hate relationship that Rugby Morning is going through with Joaquin de la Vega Mendia. No lega Vega Mendia needs a leg, and he did not. He had no lega, as you would say, Matt.
You gotta sit down.
He's got no lega in round 13. So moving on to matchup number 3, another big fantasy performance, and this is what I was talking about, the highs and lows. So we had a close matchup between Feral Hippies and the Rugby Morning, and this was a high and low one. Victoria's Secret, 49.3 fantasy points, and like I said, obviously a lot of this is coming from that Seattle match, but Lance Williams, he made a contribution in that Utah Warriors game, 15.9 fantasy points for him. Futi, 15.5 fantasy points, those 2 tries in that Seattle Seawolves match. And then Big Bong Theory just could not muster up any, significant points. The biggest performance, Kotzer and Talatina, each getting 3 fantasy points off of try assists. Not even close to making it competitive against Malcolm's 49.3 fantasy performance. He falls 49.3 to 13. And then our last fantasy matchup of the week, once again, man, the Rucking Goat, Vandy, his struggles keep on continuing. He has a lot of San Diego guys, kind of similar to how San Diego played this week, not really coming through for him. Biggest performer, once again, was his set piece bonus point, which is optimistic. I will say Wayne Vanderbank was on his bench, 7.4 fantasy points. It would have made a little bit of a difference, but when you're going up against John and his lads on tour team that includes an explosive Ed Fido, you're not gonna come close to that. So
the other thing that we know in this league, and I think Vandy should know well enough, is that if you see a Durr in their name, you put them in Durr starting lineup. Right? That's what we do in this league. Vander Sheep.
That's what we do in this league.
Vanderbank. He's in the line.
Put Durr in your line, Matt. You got to stop, man. I wish I had. Here, I got this for you. Great. That was good.
You got to sound clip these things really quick, Ryan, while I got them on my brain.
Right.
But Vandy, hate to kick you when you're down, but sucks to suck. I'm going to beat you next week. Okay, let's go on.
Well, it makes things interesting. John, 42.2 win over the Rucking Goats, 9 points. Now, where this gets interesting is to this standing breakdown. And I mentioned it at the top of the show. As a commissioner, if you would have asked me to have it as tight as it is, and with as many storylines and as many things on the line heading into our final week of the regular season, of the fantasy regular season, I should add, because the semifinals is going to be in week 16, the finals in week 17. Man, it is tight. So let's break it down here. Sitting at the number 1 spot, he sat there last week. The dankest anchor sitting at a 9-5 record, and it is total points of 415, the highest in the league. That makes him at that top spot. John is following right behind him with a 9-5 record, but that around 30 point total point difference is what has him set behind. Victoria's Secret, 8-5-1, and Matt, that historic tie that you had with him may just be the saving grace for Malcolm in keeping him in the playoffs because he locked up a playoff spot. So Dankus Anchors, Lads on Tour, Victoria's Secret, all three of them locking up their playoff spots with a 9-5 record for the top two, 8-5 and 1 for Malcolm. This is where things get interesting. Sitting in the 4, 5, and 6 spots, hunting down that last spot, that fourth spot in the playoffs. Rugby Morning, 7-7 record. Feral Hippies, 7-7 record. And Bing Bong Theory, 7-7 record. So all of them sharing the same exact record heading into the final week for that last playoff spot, only separated by a margin of around 50 fantasy points. So definitely in the realm, if you put up a big week, you can definitely be seeing some movement here. And then on top of that, you have Ruck and Roll, Matt, so you, sitting at a 4-9-1 record. I will say, you've boosted up that total points for, you're in 7th. That total points for record, 308.3 total points on the season. This past 48-point performance has been huge for you. Now, I will say, Matt, you were in 7th place last week with that tie because Vandy lost. Vandy is now at the bottom at 4-10. But now that all the listeners, now all that the viewers out there understand where we are sitting in the standings, and for all of you who are having a hard time following along, these standings will be posted this week on social media, along with what's at stake, for you to have a listen on what is really at stake here for these standings. And a lot of it has to come, Matt, for the matchups that are coming in round 15. So let me first break down the matchups. We have Lads on Tour taking on the Dankus Anchors. We have the Feral Hippies taking on the Victoria's Secret. We have Rugby Morning taking on Bing Bong Theory. And we have the Rucking Goat taking on you, Matt, Ruck and Roll. Now, where this gets very interesting is the Lads on Tour, Dankus Anchors, sitting in the 1 and 2 spots. Winner of that match is going to win the top spot in our league. Pretty big. So they'll head into the playoffs with the number 1 seed. Feral Hippies take on Victoria's Secret. Not as much implication here. Victoria's Secret has already locked up a spot. However, this is a big one for Feral Hippies. He's going to need to get the win in order to have a chance at the playoffs because it is Rugby Morning and Bing Bong Theory meeting in that third matchup. That means the winner of that matchup will most likely make it into playoffs. Mind you, depending on what happens on that Feral Hippies game. Pretty tight. And then to round it all off, Matt, and this is where you can come in. You weren't here for this, but I'm sure you heard when you listened to the episode. Steven, when he attended the episode a couple weeks back, laid down a very interesting bet for you and Vandy. For the team who finished higher in the fantasy playoffs, in the fantasy regular season standings, will get a jersey sent to you from him. And he showed the Utah Warriors jersey, training jersey that he has for Vandy. I'm not too sure what he has for you, but it is sitting there. And now with both of your losses, and despite you having the tie, the winner of your matchup next week is going to win that bet between you and Vandy that Steven laid down for you.
Oh, okay.
So talk about storylines, I talk about heading into the last week.
There's a battle for everything this week. There's a battle for everything.
Battle for first place, battle for playoffs, battle for a lovely jersey, a pity jersey for you and Vandy.
Yeah. So we've got the 7 battles of Texas in the MLR, and then in the Fantasy Ruckers League, we've got the 3 battle for playoffs and the 1 battle for sorrow and pittiness and something to cry into at night.
I guess so, but I mean, dude, that is incredible. I really couldn't have scripted it any better. Like I couldn't have written it any better. I can't believe it turned out the way it did. So it's really exciting. So all of you listening, you'll want to stay tuned with how these matchups will all pan out, because man, there is a whole lot riding in round 14 that will have in round 15 that's going to have huge implications going forward into our fantasy playoffs. And let me remind everyone out there listening on what's at stake. First of all, It is looking like we are maximizing our money that is going to charity, because we mentioned at the start of the season that in addition to the prize pot that we'll get into, for every team that finishes ahead of Vandy, we will donate an additional $20. And I believe, depending on your matchup with Vandy, Matt, the highest that he can finish is 7th. So at least we are spending at least $120 extra to charity.
So I'm winning for charity.
You're winning for charity. So on top of the jersey, you're winning for charity. Exactly that. So it looks like we'll be spending that for charity. And then, yeah, what everyone's playing for in this fantasy playoffs, whoever the top 4 teams will enter the fantasy playoffs that will be played in round 16 and 17 respectively. They will be playing for a total of $100 that will go towards a fantasy, or excuse me, to a charity of the winner's choice, and that will go along the additional $120 or $140 that we'll send along with that to that charity of the choice in the final matchup. And there, I will sneak peek. There may also be another little something for the winner as well, but I can't get it too far ahead of myself. You'll have to make it to the playoffs to have a chance at that in the first place. But yes, a lot of stuff riding heading in to these fantasy playoffs. Yeah, like we said, Matt, storylines couldn't write it better itself, and then we're going to be glued to our screens in round 15, watching not only the implications that it has from an MLR standpoint, but also especially from a fantasy standpoint, clearly, as it is shown in our standings, which you'll be able to find on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. So let's break it down here, Matt, and let's move on to the round 15 match preview. When it comes to a waiver wire, I'll just touch on it quickly. There's not much out there. And for our league managers, you're really just looking at guys that I think are insurance guys heading in to your playoffs if you've already locked in a spot. Or, yes, I won't forget. I was just going to say, you say it with me, Matt.
Whoever's facing the Dallas Jackals.
Which is the Toronto Arrows.
Toronto Arrows, boys.
There we go.
That's what that
was terrible synchronization by you and I there.
That was
but
bad
yes.
synchronization, but what you know is going to sync well is me and picking up Toronto Arrows. So
there we go. So you want to look out for Toronto Arrows, guys, but outside that, maybe I'll provide some advice if you're one of John, Hokie, or Malcolm that has already locked up your spot. Hey, maybe pick up some handcuff guys that go along with some of your key positions, like your fly half, like your scrum half, just in case. You don't know how these lineups are going to shake up, especially when teams start to lock in their playoff spots. We don't know if there's going to be they'll be starting guys that usually don't start anymore. So maybe it's time to get some of those insurance guys before the flurry of those waiver wire periods come and you're stuck in a difficult situation. So let's talk about some of these.
1 second.
Yeah.
Do we have a trade? Did trade deadline pass?
We did not have an official trade deadline. That being said, we only had one official trade that occurred in our league. And I will say it is a pretty significant trade. It was Dean Muir for Cam Dolan between Hokie and Steven. Ever since then, Dean Muir has been a weekly starter in Steven's lineup. Cam Dolan has since been dropped in our league. So there is, I think we can say who won that trade. But yeah, the deadline has passed, I guess. There hasn't been any trades, at least since for a certain amount of time. But with that being said, there won't be any trades being made heading into these playoffs, but there'll be some key roster moves being made. So you'll be wanting to take a little peek, at least, at the waiver wire and make some insurance moves at the very least.
Unless somebody needs somebody, and if they some fab to get Milner Scudder. Well, nobody else can get it.
At the very least, Matt, you'll be able to outbid Steven for sure, because Steven has $0 fab dollars after last week. So he's been in our Discord trying to sway people. Hey, don't put any money on it, man. Let's make this an even playing field. But I'm not too sure everyone is going to buy into that. But with that being said, let's move on to some of those players you might pick up that will have an impact in round 15 and talk about some of these round 15 matchups. As we get into round 15, we'll talk about some of the playoff pictures when it comes to the MLR. The New England Free Jacks became the first team to clinch their playoff spot. So like I said, you may want to take an extra look at the New England Free Jacks lineup. Maybe we didn't touch on the news and notes. It did look like Bodine Walker got shaken up in that match, in the New England Free Jacks match. So maybe they err on the side of, sitting him this next week, which would be interesting. and would have fantasy implications. So start to look at those teams that start locking up playoff spots, because it may have a implication on your lineups moving forward. And then officially, Old Glory DC and the NOLA Gold have both been officially eliminated from playoff contention. So those are kind of the scenarios heading into round 14's matchups. We got some exciting matches. New England Free Jacks taking on Rugby Atlanta to open the week. We got the Toronto Arrows taking on the Dallas Jackals, Houston Sabercats taking on the Utah Warriors, the NOLA Gold taking on Old Glory DC, Rugby New York taking the Seattle Seawolves, and the San Diego Legion taking on the LA Guiltini. So a full slate of matchups. Interesting enough, in a week that has pretty big fantasy implication, like we mentioned, one of the MLR's biggest teams aren't playing in the Austin Algronis. I know a lot of teams rely heavily on some of the fantasy performers from that team. They'll have to look elsewhere this week because they are on bye. So Matt, let's walk through these matchups. We don't have to spend long on it, but let's talk about it. We introduced this new segment last week, and we're going to continue doing that throughout the rest of this season. We'll see whether or not we continue it going on into the next 2023 campaign. But it is a project that a man on Reddit by the name of Oddball Gentleman, who created this thing called tacklethenumbers.gloriousrugby.com. And essentially it's like a picks thing. He creates this spread and you're able to make a picks and it tracks it all year long, and you can play against other people. It's a really, really fun thing. So make sure you check that out. But we're going to start playing along with here and making some of these picks along with the spreads that they've created. And luckily enough, by the time that we are recording this podcast, he's been nice enough this week to post the spread. So we're going to go along here and make our picks and have any notes on the games that we do have from a fantasy standpoint. So we'll start off, Matt, here with the first match of the week. The New England Free Jacks taking on Rugby Atlanta in New England. This line is favors New England by 7. Who do you got here, and what are you thinking about this matchup, both from an MLR and fantasy perspective?
Well, I think Rugby Atlanta is going to be pushing pretty hard for a win here, just because they also got Houston down their throats as well. So they'll be pushing for a win. Honestly, I think New England Free Jacks, they actually don't play their full guys. Rugby Atlanta comes out there playing their best. Rugby Atlanta comes in and either takes a dub or keeps it within 7.
And I will say Rugby Atlanta is fighting for that final playoff spot. They're sitting in that final third spot in the East Coast. And obviously coming off of that loss against the Utah Warriors, there's, I think, a little bit more to play for. And keep in mind, like we mentioned, New England Free Jacks already locking up their playoff spot. So I'm not too sure if maybe you may see a different lineup that may not be as strong this week. So with that being said, I think I too have to side with the Rugby Atlanta pick. I'm not too sure if they're going to come out with a win, but I do think they're at least going to keep it close. Easy, well, maybe I shouldn't say easy one, but Toronto taking on Dallas in Toronto. What makes it difficult here is the spread is 23.
Small, don't you think?
Oh my gosh. It's 23 points. Whether you think that's small, whether you think that's big, I'll let you make that opinion. The spread, I guess that was covered this past week, was a total 64 points. I will say that was a historic 64 points, like we mentioned. Will they cover 23, Matt, in this first week? What?
23 isn't even half of that.
23 is, what do you mean 23 isn't even half? Yeah, it isn't half of that. No, it isn't. So that maybe,
So like 23 is a joke. Toronto Arrow is going to cover this like a joke. Watch out for Ronan Foley. That guy's going to put up a couple. I'm picking him up. Good luck to everybody else trying to get him.
All right. Well, Ronan Foley he was the one bright spot in this past week's matchup against Rugby New York. I agree. 23 points is a big spread, but just the way, how can you not pick that after they lost to Seattle by as much as they did, 74-7. I mean, last week the spread was 18 points. This week he kindly bumped it up by 5 because of that 74-point win. So yeah, I think if you had to put your money on it, you're probably siding with Toronto on this one. Next one, the NOLA Gold taking on Old Glory DC in New Orleans. It's an even one. It's a pick 'em here at 0 at a no spread at all, even. Who are you going with here, Matt, on this NOLA Gold Old Glory DC matchup?
I love me some Old Glory DC. I mean, it doesn't matter anyway. So you know, I'll take Old Glory DC. I like them.
Yeah, it looks like we're pretty even on here. I like Old Glory DC as well. I think they'll outright win this game. They've been looking really good these past couple of weeks. I think they're on the upswing, and NOLA has had some struggles. Now, mind you, they are coming off the bye, and I find that this teams that we do cover that do come off the bye do play pretty well, but. I think Old Glory DC at the end of the day is just a better team. Moving on to Houston SaberCats taking on the Utah Warriors in Texas. The spread is -7 in favor of Houston. What you got here, Matt?
I mean, I'm going to go with Houston. They've got something to fight for. Utah, I mean, sure, they beat Rattle last week, but Houston's got something big to fight for, so I'm sure they'll be coming out strong. And they're going to space next game, so I got to take Houston.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because like yours, they've looked so good. They're really coming into form. They got a lot to play for, obviously, because they are in that playoff push. They are sitting right now in that fourth spot with a 7-5 record, but they have the same amount of wins as the Seattle Seawolves, who have played one more game and sitting at a 7-6 record. So obviously there'll be a lot to play for there. From my end, I don't think the Utah Warriors are going to win this match, but I do think they're a team that will keep it within 7. It's hard for me to say because they've looked not good in a lot of matches, but they've earned my trust back after beating the Rugby Atlanta by the amount they did this past week and having a good performance. And hey, it's Vandy's team, so I want to side with Vandy's team. Moving on to Rugby New York, and this line actually surprised me with how Oddball Gentlemen set this. Rugby New York playing in New York, taking on the Seattle Seawolves. It's actually a +2, but in favor of the Seattle Seawolves. Not too sure if I agree with this one though, Matt. What do you have in this one?
I mean, let's assume that Naholo's back, or Naholo's in the lineup this weekend. I'm going to say Rugby New York definitely wins here against the Seawolves.
Yeah, I do agree as well. I think obviously that match last week is inflated by the Dallas Jackals.
Yes.
At the end of the day, Rugby New York is the better team than Seattle. I do think they as well come away with the win. And a matchup that I think many people were looking for, a battle in the West Coast, the Guiltinis taking on the San Diego Legion in San Diego. The spread is 8 in favor of the Guiltinis. The Guiltinis have been looking pretty hot here the past few weeks, coming off of the big tight win against the Gilgronis. Any way that the Legion keeps it within 8 here?
I mean, I think the Guiltinis will score enough tries to cover it. Not gonna say that it's gonna be like a blowout. I just think that the Guiltinis will be able to get ahead by 8.
Yeah, I think so too. I think the San Diego Legion will start to try to turn things around because I think they've been out of character for the past little bit here and been out of form. They are a lot better of a team than they've been playing with. The Guiltinis have been in form going forward.
Maybe Big Joe gets back in there and they turn it around, you know?
And I wanted to talk to Vanny about that because it wasn't interesting in some of the lineups that were made. But yeah, it's a big matchup that's on the line. I would expect to see Joe back in the lineup, which would make things interesting for that matchup between you and Vandy. Sure. Outside of picking up Toronto players against Dallas, is there any other matchups, Matt, before we wrap up the round of 15 preview that maybe intrigues you a little bit?
I mean, I was honestly just thinking about the fact that Rugby Atlanta 8-4 are going up against the New England Free Jacks. That's a pretty tough matchup when you just look at the names. And then you got the Arrows against the Jackals. So the Arrows are feeling pretty confident about going into this round.
Right.
And then you got New York against the Seawolves, which is like the midfield battle. But the fact that Atlanta kind of has Toronto Arrows and Rugby New York kind of just breathing down their neck, and both of them don't have nearly as difficult matchups, it's got to be pressure. So I'll be looking out for this Rugby Atlanta team to really be pushing it against this Free Jacks team. So we'll see. Yeah, this is a rematch of 2 weeks ago. So
something like that. Yeah, I want to. I don't have it in front of me right now, but
I think the fact that it's a rematch also, of like 2 or 3 weeks ago. Both are going to be very familiar with each other. I think that'll be a good matchup.
Yeah, I think it'll be...
Maybe not for fantasy, but rugby-wise, I think it'll be real good.
Yeah, I mean, from a fantasy perspective, and maybe not so much from a marquee perspective, because I do agree with you there. The playoff race in our league is obviously getting heated, but so is the playoff race in the actual MLR, and especially that East Coast one. And yeah, you mentioned this matchup between Rugby Atlanta and New England Free Jacks is going to be huge for Atlanta, especially with Toronto breathing down their backs. But from a fantasy perspective, I will say I think this NOLA Gold Old Glory DC match is going to have a lot of points. NOLA has looked pretty shoddy on the defensive end at certain points, and DC has been shaping up. There are certain players on that team that I would definitely try to side with. You're talking about Penny Lasaka. You're talking about Tanana, Roberts Tanana on Old Glory as well. Yeah, I think there'll be points ahead, even on the NOLA side too, because just look at them to try to pull back in this game. It should be interesting. So yeah, few pointers. Pick up your Toronto guys. Stay tuned for that Eastern Conference the playoff matchup. Even the Western Conference matchup is pretty good. And then, hey, my tip to the league members is maybe have a look at that NOLA Old Glory matchup. There might be fantasy points.
I actually agree with you there. I think they're going to kind of just risk it, just whatever, what they got to lose, they just play and have some fun. But I was going to finish the show off with something a little bit on the more toxic side. But it's got to be said. He's not here. I wish he was here. But we're talking about the man, the myth, the legend, Vandy. So I talked earlier in the show about being very close to the Houston SaberCats and their trends.
Yeah.
Vandy has found himself in a peculiar comparison with a certain team that also decides to hurt themselves mid-season. And better yet, hurts their backs. So I'm going to say that Vandy just happens to be maybe the Dallas Jackals.
Oh my
God. The Rucking Goat just comes straight into last place.
The one difference that's hard to pick that up, Matt, is that the Dallas Jackals have yet to pick up a win, and at least Vandy has 4 of them on the season. So and one of them being against you too. So I will say there is that too. But it will be interesting.
We're talking about ladders, Vandy. Karma.
Hey, I'm not going to say anything. We wish that guy a speedy recovery, but yeah, I think you're pretty excited to have that guy back, hopefully whenever he is to pick his brain, because
it's been too long.
You guys are having separation anxiety. It's been too long with you guys have been apart, you know?
Yeah, I've been my brain has just been thinking of all these ways that I can make him more miserable about the Utah Warriors and fantasy rugby, but
well, I don't know. We'll see whether or not maybe that misery turns around a little bit with this big matchup between you and him that's going to decide this bet that Steven has laid out for you. That's made it real interesting. I will ask you this, Matt, before we wrap up this show. After going on your self-healing trip, after seemingly turning things around, because I mentioned to you before, I don't think your season has been as bad as it says, or as it appears to have been. I mean, you've scored 20 plus points since like round 8, I think, or round 9. So that's pretty impressive. Now, do you feel after you went on this trip, you've racked up a couple dubs on your belt? I guess you prayed to the fantasy rugby gods. You were able to, get some of that stuff together. And you look to be trending in the right direction, at least after putting up a historical performance in round 14 with 48.3 points.
Yep.
Do you feel after this show that you have all the storylines, you're all caught up, you have all the information and good stuff you need to beat Vandy next week to steal that Utah Warriors jersey away from him?
I am going to absolutely put on a showing this week against the Rucking Goat. He is not going to show up to the next show.
Oh my God.
He will not show up to the next show because he's going to be so sad about the Utah Warriors losing, the Rucking Goat losing, me wearing a Utah Warriors jersey while beating him. These are all the crazies that's gonna happen. Stay tuned.
Yeah, it's gonna be a whole lot of crazy. And I will say, be careful, Matt, because that guy has threatened to not appear on this show before. He has made it every single time. Didn't make it this
won't do
time.
it.
He didn't threaten with it. Now, I will say that there is a chance, instead of a back injury, he's already like hitting the books and making sure that his lineup for this coming week is already stellar. Don't know, but I'm sure he'll be itching to get back. But yeah, talk about storylines, Matt. We got a battle for first place. We got a battle for the highly coveted last playoff spot in our inaugural fantasy rugby playoffs, and the bet between Vandy and Maddie for that highly coveted Utah Warriors jersey, or whatever jersey that Steven has in store for them. That will be decided in round 15's matchups as well. You are not going to want to miss any of it. To make sure you're staying on top of all it, follow us at the Fantasy Ruckers. There you'll get all the latest updates on the matchups, how maybe you can join a future fantasy rugby league, a future fantasy MLR league in the near future, and everything else fantasy rugby related within the MLR. So with that being said, for Matthew Yee, for Devin Vandy Vanderpool, enjoy the round 15 matchup this week. Enjoy the fantasy rugby matchup this week that are going to be very, very entertaining. We'll definitely be watching very closely, and we will see you next Wednesday.
We love you, Vandy.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.